Welcome to Voices of Football. I'm your host, Jim Nichol-Turner, and I'm joined today by BBC commentator Steve Wilson. Steve, it's a pleasure to have you on today.
Thank you for asking me, Jim. Hello.
Hello. I think the best place to start would be to start with the beginning of your career. What can you tell me about what you remember that got you into football commentary?
It's a slightly long and torturous kind of process, I suppose. So I'll keep it brief, I guess. But when I left school, I went to Surrey University to do a course in hotel and catering management, which I absolutely hated, if I'm honest with you. But the one good thing, I lasted 18 months there before I left. But the one good thing that I did learn there really was that they had a university radio station, and I got involved in that primarily because I'm really into my music and I wanted to sort of, be a kind of poor man's DJ. And so I learned how to use a radio desk, while I was there. Um, didn't learn much about hotel and catering management, and after about 18 months I decided that I really should try and get out of that, which I did. And I then went back to Liverpool University, where I did English language and literature degree. And they didn't have a radio station, but they did have a newspaper, so I started writing about sport for the newspaper. So I suppose that was the beginnings, if you like, though I had no thought of this becoming a career or anything at the time, until towards the end of my final year at Liverpool, when I did some work experience at Radio Merseyside. So I guess I must have been thinking that I was interested in this as a possible career. And then I applied after graduating to the BBC for a postgraduate news journalism trainee scheme, which I didn't actually get on, but it turned out I didn't really know it at the time. It turned out I did really well. There was quite a lot of application processes and two or three interviews, local interviews, then regional, then national. And I got to the national interviews and didn't get the post, unfortunately. But I did get a job in London, which was my main motivation. I just wanted to move to London. So I got a job in London with a small publishing company in Clapham. And then started getting involved at the weekends using my sort of little bit of tiny bit of experience at university, and the fact that I'd applied for this BBC course, and sort of obviously I knew I'd done okay, um, to literally go in on a Saturday to Capital Radio and get a bit of work experience there. And it turned out there was a guy at Capital Radio called Pete Simmons, who was a sort of senior sports producer, really. And he told me, I had no idea. He was ex BBC, and he said you probably, he reckoned I got down to about the last 25 people for this news journalism post grad scheme, out of what was probably thousands of applications. So he kind of took that as a plus, even though I hadn't got the gig, so to speak. So I didn't realize quite how well I'd done, I think. But anyway, so he was great. And, a couple of people at Capital kind of took me under their wing. And I was lucky enough that I'd only been in London for probably about 4 or 5 months when one of the guys at Capital Radio left to move to Radio Trent in Nottingham, which is where he was from, and he was keen to move back home. And that kind of meant that it was a fairly small team on sport. There was only 5 or 6 full-time people, but it meant that everybody kind of shuffled up one, and there was a gap at the bottom, and they offered me the job. So I left what was a sales job in publishing to go and do that. And not commentary particularly, but reading sports bulletins, going out to press conferences, interviewing people, some match reporting. Not all football, could be anything. But that's really where I started. So it was kind of a mixture of luck and talent and people being willing to help you and take you under their wing, and sort of
Opportunities as
guide
well.
you. Yeah, exactly, and try and guide you in the right direction. And without that guidance from people who kind of got into the industry, well, I found it really, really helpful. So, I try as far as I can when people ask me if I can help them, even though my experience was kind of the early 90s, so it feels like so long ago. Um, I try and give them some guidance if I can. But the landscape has changed massively since then. There's so many different ways of getting into the industry now.
Yeah, of course. I suppose the main
But
one.
it's also still really, really difficult. It was difficult then, and it's
Yeah,
maybe even more difficult now.
yeah, exactly. I mean, as you're saying, I suppose one of the big ones would be social media. I mean, that opens up so many more opportunities for people to sort of worm into the industry, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I started out, the only real route into broadcast media really was through local radio. It's paid broadcast media. There's always hospital radio, and I recommend all those things as a sort of work experience and whatever. Um, but local radio was kind of it. Now, well, if you're talking about sports media now, most football clubs have a media. Well, all professional football clubs have a media department, and will be producing YouTube content or web content or vlogs or whatever TikTok stuff. And that none of that existed, obviously, and there was no thing as club media really back in the day. There was a guy who kind of managed the press and doled out dealt with the applications for media tickets and
Yeah,
perhaps sort of marshaled the odd interview or something. But it was minute compared to what it is now. I mean, even the sort of mid-ranking championship club will have a host of people working in their media department. So whilst, as I was saying before, there are far more routes into the industry. But having said that, also 30 years ago, there weren't countless kind of university or other college courses churning out media studies graduates.
yeah, of
So
course.
there are these days. There may be more opportunities, but there are also far more people than there used to be who feel they're qualified to do the job,
Yeah,
which means it's equally as competitive as it used to be.
yeah, of course. So you've been at the BBC now in some capacity for over 20 years, and you've in that time you've covered your fair share of 3 p.m. matches on a Saturday afternoon. The Premier League has, it's sort of reinforced the fact that they don't have any sort of plans to scrap the 3 p.m.
Mm-hmm.
blackout. So I'm wondering what's your take on that from a commentator's perspective?
I think it would be. I mean, not necessarily, Jim, as a commentator's perspective, but as someone who's in the industry, but also as someone who's a football fan, and
Mm,
actually a fan of Tranmere Rovers is my local team, not where I live now, but where I was brought up. So I look at it as how it would impact upon clubs of that ilk if the blackout was lifted. And I think it would have quite a serious impact actually on their ability, those clubs' ability to attract people to their ground, to their matches.
mm,
Um, I am a bit of a traditionalist, and I do prefer a Saturday 3 o'clock kickoff. They seem to be increasingly rare these days. I mean, I suppose in the way it's impacted on a commentator's life is that when I started at Capital Radio, um, probably 95 or 99% of matches were played on a Saturday afternoon. And, you could almost guarantee being off on a Sunday. And now a Sunday off is like a rarity, and a Saturday off
yeah,
is completely unheard of. Um, so in that way, it's impacted. But I mean, that's neither here nor there in the scheme of things. I think it would be bad for grassroots football or lower division football, lower down the pyramid. I think it would be really bad because ultimately, I think people are kind of programmed to be quite lazy. And if there is decent football on the TV on a Saturday afternoon, there will be people who will think, oh, I'll just stay in and watch that,
yeah,
rather than get in the car or get on the bus or train or whatever and go and watch their local team play. So I think it would have a negative impact. So generally speaking, I'm all in favour of keeping it. The only time, of course, we didn't really have that, and it was very strange, was when during lockdown when fans weren't around and weren't allowed in grounds, and every game was televised, and that was, well, that whole experience was surreal for everybody. But our jobs after the break, when there was no football, our jobs restarted when football started. So it was a really, really strange time of
yeah.
being one of a few dozen people in a football stadium when Liverpool are winning the Premier League title. And it involved staying in hotels when I was the only person staying there, and some very,
Yeah.
very
I mean, were
weird
you
experiences.
were commentators? Was it always the case that you were granted access into grounds, or were there certain circumstances where you'd have to commentate a game remotely?
Well, for match of the day in the Premier League, we were always in the ground. Yeah, so we were always in the ground. I mean, my job is, and you know, this is no secret in the industry. I think you know, there are the BBC. Basically, the BBC are always on site at the ground. So television, radio, you're always on site, commentating from the stadium. Um, I do because I'm freelance. I have a contract with the BBC, but I can work for other people. So I do a lot of what they call world feed commentary. So that might involve, for example, in the Champions League quarterfinals, I'm going to be commentating on both legs of Benfica against Inter Milan. I won't be in Lisbon and I won't be in Milan. I'll be in Chiswick, sitting in a little soundproof box, watching it on watching it on the telly. So in commentary terms, that's what they call an off-tube commentary. Tube being the TV. And a lot of the kind of world feed commentaries are done off tube. So that's sort of quite accepted. And you will also find that really for cost purposes as much as anything else. So when BT Sport, for example, who obviously have the rights to the Champions League at the moment, if they're commentating on Real Madrid against Liverpool, then their team will be in Madrid at the Bernabeu. If you're watching Besiktas against Galatasaray, then they're definitely not. They're going to be in Stratford in London.
Right.
So, you know, basically for the British teams, they'll be on site, but obviously they show footage of all the Champions League games,
Yeah.
and the rest of them they won't be there. They'll be at BT in London. So, which actually, from a freelance commentator's point of view, is quite useful because. The same company also provide a world feed commentary for Europa League matches. So, for example, I can be working on a Wednesday night on a Champions League game and on a Thursday night on a Europa League game. And I only have to go to Chiswick. That would be impossible if I had to go to Milan on Wednesday and then Istanbul on Thursday. You know, that would be it'd be nice, but
I was going to
obviously
say,
it
it'd be
would
quite the
actually be
adventure,
impossible.
wouldn't it?
Oh, it'd be lovely. Yeah, no, it'd be great from a travel point of view, but you would find that actually you wouldn't be able to cover as many games. Just it'd be
No.
impossible.
Yeah, of
So
course.
so off tube, that's what off tube commentary is, and but you know certainly with BBC and with Sky with Premier League coverage and BT with their Premier League coverage, you are always on site, and in those games during the lockdown when there was no one in the stadium, no fans in the stadium, we were in the stadium.
Yeah, right. Okay. That's fascinating. Just hearing you talk about the off-tube commentary. Speaking of grounds and being in grounds, what ground do you think when you see your name next to the fixture list that and you think, oh, I'm going to be going there this week? Which one do you look forward to most?
Um, yeah. Well, I'm a big lover of foreign grounds because I do like traveling. Having just said that, you know, it would be restrictive on the amount of work you could do. I love traveling and I love going to foreign grounds. So um, I've been to most of the big grounds in Europe. The exception, I'm turning your question around a little bit, Jim. The one ground I haven't been to, which I really wished I had been to, is probably the Allianz Arena in Munich. I've been to the old one, the Olympic
Right. Okay.
Stadium
Yeah.
where Bayern used to play, but I've never been to the Allianz. I'd love to go there. Um, in terms of Premier League, you know, I mean, they all have their own attractions. You know, I think Manchester City is sort of architecturally really, really pleasing. And will be even better when they finally extend the other end of the ground, and then it'll be a sort of it'll be quite sort of architecturally impressive. Um, it's not always the most atmospheric. I mean, Goodison is like a fantastic throwback to how football grounds used to be back in the day. So is Elland Road. I love going to both of those. Really atmospheric places, not always filled with positivity these days, but atmospheric nonetheless. St James's Park is always great.
Yeah.
And I really like the Amex, Brighton's ground, you know, because
Wow.
it's a lovely ground. It's a really terrific ground. And you know, the club are very, very friendly. I think the atmosphere this season has been brilliant because obviously they're having a great season. Um, and it's you know, at the end of the day, a lot of driving around motorways is involved in this job, and I can get to the Amex in about 30 minutes. So that's quite
Oh, that
nice.
helps, doesn't it?
It does help. It does help if you can get home after a game for like if you're home by 6:30 in the evening, it
Yeah.
makes a difference. Um, so um, yeah, but I mean, all the grounds are really of such a high quality
Yeah.
now. I mean, Bournemouth is about as good as it can be given what they have. But I think that they've got plans for a new stadium. I'm
Yeah.
really excited about seeing Everton's new ground, which looks fantastic. But as I say, I'll really miss Goodison, as I think a lot of
Yeah,
people will, because
that's
it's one of the last.
it's interesting because Everton have adopted the approach of just tearing down the ground and building a new one. You see Liverpool
Mm,
have opted for the redevelopment, and you see
yeah.
Anfield is being redeveloped at the minute. Another thing I wanted to touch on was that players get influenced by the crowd. Does that happen in commentary as well? Do you go to a ground and feel like your commentary is better because the crowd is more uplifting or the atmosphere is?
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I thought you were going to ask me if you kind of swayed to be biased, and I would sort of, I would, um, my last ounce of breath, I would say that I've never been biased while I'm actually commentating. But yes, I mean, and one example of that is there are some grounds abroad where occasionally you will be sitting in a glass box commentating. Parc des Princes is one of them. New Camp used to be one. I'm not sure. I haven't been there for a while. So you're literally behind glass. You're in a glass soundproof box, and you can hardly hear the crowd. And that is a very different experience and a much, much worse one. Um, some people imagine that, we're kind of sitting inside behind glass in comfortable chairs with, people bringing you prawn sandwiches or something. Well, the reality couldn't be any further from the truth, really. You're always outside in England, in English grounds, you're always outside. You're
Yeah.
normally hanging from the roof on some rusty old gantry with the wind and rain blowing in, and you're normally freezing cold. um, and you can't get a cup of coffee, let alone go to the toilet. So yeah, the reality of it is, it's tremendously exciting. I'm not moaning about it. It's fantastic. But the reality of it from 3 till 4:45 is not as glamorous as some people might imagine.
Yeah, I can imagine. I can imagine. Um, you were there. It's almost 11 years ago now, but you were there at the Stadium of Light when Manchester United beat Sunderland by a goal to nil, but missed out on the Premier League title with that incredible Aguero moment. What can you recall from that day?
um, I mean, I'm not sure it'll ever be repeated. I mean, I suppose statistically, if you wait long enough, it probably will be. But yeah, it was one of the great climaxes to a season. And when the final whistle went, Man United thought they were champions. I mean,
Yeah,
they didn't, because they knew the City game hadn't finished, so they weren't actually celebrating, but they were ready to celebrate. And then the news came through that obviously Aguero had scored, and I suppose the only thing I really remember about it is that in the post-match interviews, Alex Ferguson was incredibly gracious to Manchester City. And he also said, we will never allow ourselves to lose the title on goal difference again. Or was it goals scored? I can't remember, but it was one
yeah,
goal, I think.
something like that.
Um,
I think it was the
and
defeat that they suffered. The 6-1, I think, came the same season, and I think that was what swayed
yeah,
in
yeah.
favour of City in the end.
And I also remember Rio Ferdinand, who I think was probably Man U captain at the time, and he came out and did the post match, which can't have been easy. And he didn't refer to Manchester City by name. He just called them the other team about 4 times in the interview, or the other club, or whatever it was. He said, he didn't say congratulations to Manchester City. He just said congratulations to the other club. They've had a great season and well done them. It wasn't, there was no, he didn't even mention them by name. But yeah, that was extraordinary. And slightly lost in the midst of times. You see the Aguero goal, countless times. But the scenes at Sunderland were sort of equally. It was like a human tragedy being played out in front of your eyes, really. Yeah, pretty dramatic.
Yeah, wow, that's incredible. And just finally, I wondered if you had any sort of advice for viewers who want to get into football commentary.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll say what I kind of always say, I suppose, which is, basically, I mean, I'm imagining a sort of viewer, so I don't know exactly what age the people are I'm talking to, I suppose, but wherever you are in your life or career, really, your starting point is still um, your very first starting point is still to actually engage in the media. So, you should be reading newspapers. You should be, with this applies whether you want to do news or sport or whatever, you should be listening to the radio. You should be watching the TV, and forming opinions about the coverage, what you think could be improved, what you think isn't great. You should be getting in touch with your local newspaper and saying, can I come and do summer work experience if you're still at school, or your local radio station. I mean, believe me, these places have tiny budgets. You're not going to get paid for it, but you are going to get some really good experience. And they will, generally speaking, if they can, be pretty happy to take you on because they don't have much money. So a kind of, an enthusiastic volunteer is like gold dust. So that would be a very basic starting point. It's like it's like people who want to be novelists but who don't read novels. Well, how can you write a book if you don't read them? So if you don't engage and you're not interested in the media and want to listen to the radio news programs, the Today program on Radio 4 is, the flagship news program on British radio. I would recommend people listen to it. You should be working out who is your favorite sports writer and why. And actually, I'll throw this in because I was completely flummoxed in that interview I told you about, the final interview for the BBC Postgrad News Scheme. I was sitting, there were about 3 people, I think, in the room, interviewing me. And one of the questions, and I had no sensible answer for it, was who is your least favorite BBC news correspondent and why? Well, under the pressure of the moment, I could hardly name a BBC news correspondent. I mean, I could have done but under that pressure,
Yeah,
it just completely threw me. So, you ought to be forming opinions about these things, because in an interview situation, you may very likely be asked for them. And if you don't have anything sensible to say, if somebody says to you, okay, so who's your favorite radio football commentator? If you can't name one, then it's pretty unlikely that they're going to be that impressed by you. So really, if you want to work in the media, you should be immersed in the media.
yeah, exactly. Take your opportunities and keep up to date with all what's going on.
What is a very difficult balance, and I understand this, and this is a very difficult balance. It's very easy for me to sit here and say be willing to work for nothing, but at the same time, if that goes on too long and too far, then you just end up with a kind of middle class a middle class intake into the media, because it's people who can afford to work for nothing who will end up doing it. And that's why I sort of have mixed feelings about internships, really. I'm not a fan of unpaid internships because it actually disqualifies so many people. Because imagine if a newspaper offered an unpaid internship and you had to go and live in London for 2 months. Well, how on earth could you do that unless you have a lot of financial support from your family? So whilst I say, go and get a week's work experience or a summer's work experience, there does come a point, and it's difficult to know exactly where that is, where, you, like everybody, you need to be paid. And but if you're still at school, if you're still at college, don't expect to be paid. Once you've graduated, then a bit of free work experience is all very well. But if they say, oh yeah, thanks very much, do you want to do another 6 weeks, then really they should be paying you.
Yeah,
because you're not a charity. But I don't know always that works that well, because people are willing to do it, and people are scared to say you need to pay me, because they know that there's a list as long as their arm of people who'll do it. If you say, oh no, I can't afford to do it, there'll be someone else waiting to take that opportunity. So it's really difficult.
Yeah, well, brilliant stuff. Thank you very much
Thank you, Jim.
for joining me. It's been a pleasure.
I've really enjoyed it, Jim. Thank you very much, and best of luck anyone who's trying to crack the nut. Good luck. It's worth it.
Thank you.